can you mute everyone? Maybe.
Sure, I did it.
Okay, great. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to Design Post-COVID Humanity, Ta'aruf, Ta'awun, Tarahum Initiative. And we have 229 students and 51 teams constantly working together to create impact on a post-COVID world, creating different forms of design, different forms of innovation, and different forms of entrepreneurial intervention. And this is really admirable. So thank you so much for all the 14 partner organizations, professors, and everyone. I'm a bit like emotional in the sense that we are reaching a stage in the DPCH program where we will be actually doing the elimination. So it becomes like a survivor, right? Survivor program. So today we have two prominent scholars. Our first speaker is Dr. Dalal Assouli, who is an assistant professor and program coordinator of the Master of Science program in Islamic Finance at College of Islamic Studies, Hamad bin Khalifa University. Previously, she worked at the International Islamic Liquidity Management Corporation in Malaysia, where she assisted with the establishment of the Sukuk program. She also held several positions in international institutions in Europe, where she had the exposure to the African, European, and Latin American markets. Dr. Assouli holds master's degrees from Neoma Business School and Paris Dauphine University, and a PhD from INC de Lyon in France. And there, Dr. Dalal, of course, you're not just a speaker, you're also an amazing colleague to me. We used to be kind of on the same floor, and it's also great to work with you, organize events with you. And thank you so much for sharing your vibrancy and your appetite of knowledge with us. And welcome again. The floor is yours.
Good evening and Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to be part of this program and of course to share some thoughts with you today. And I'm really grateful for the organizers, particularly my colleague, Dr. Evren, for inviting me to participate in this program. And I would like to congratulate all of you for choosing or for being selected to be part of this program, which I believe is very insightful. And it's really a great opportunity, especially in the current circumstances and the current global pandemic that is impacting many aspects of our daily life. So my presentation today will talk about one of particularly some of the emerging areas, or how currently the economic or financial industry is being looked at globally, and where a lot of thoughts are talking about what's post-COVID-19, what should be done, for example, to promote more ethical values within the financial industry. What is the background of that, and what are some of the approaches that are being considered by policymakers and financial institutions globally? And hopefully these thoughts should inspire you in terms of your, of course, daily life, but also for those of you who are interacting directly with the financial industry or who are already professionals in the industry, for students who are intending or wish to pursue career in the financial industry, what are the skill set they need to develop, and what are some of the considerations to consider in either your studies or your career plans. So if we look at the background, or how in the context, talking about, for example, the financial industry, we live in a fast changing global economic and financial landscape, which requires re-engineering economic growth for greater prosperity. We see a shift towards modern services and alternative financing modes, with increasing society awareness on social and environmental issues. A new paradigm, therefore, is needed to respond to repeated crises and to the pandemic-induced stagnation of the global economy. Among the key emergent topics that are impacting currently the global financial industry, we have discussions about climate change, Bitcoins, prudential regulations, sharing economy, fintech, SDGs, ESG objectives, socially responsible investing, and increasing cross-border transactions. And one of the critical considerations that we have also observed following the various financial crises, but also the pandemics, is that a butterfly beating its wings on one side of the globe can create a hurricane on the other side of the world. This means that we live in a connected world whereby any development in one country impacts the other countries globally. And therefore, all of this led us to rethink about how financial intermediation is today conducted and where financial intermediation is nowadays questioned and revisited. If we look at, for example, the 2007 subprime crisis and its impacts, the financial crisis had a devastating effect on the US economy and plunged the country into a long and deep recession, officially beginning in December 2007, but ending in June 2009. And of course, these impacts or these effects included unparalleled employment, massive declines in the gross domestic product, and of course, prolonged mortgage foreclosure crisis. If we look at the multiple causes of the crisis, a lot of them have to do with ethics directly. So a lot of ethical issues were highlighted during or as from the various multiple causes of the crisis, mainly the housing and bond bubbles, excessive leverage, lax financial regulations, disgraceful banking practices, and many other issues with regards to the conduct of some of the activities, for example, of rating agencies. And these are some of the figures, some of the alarming figures of the impacts of the crisis, whereby you had more than 80 million jobs disappeared and 17 trillion US dollar in household net worth evaporated, with the retirement account assets fell by 2.8 trillion US dollars and home prices plummeted by 32%, in addition to more than 8 million home foreclosures and a shrink of the GDP by 4.7%. Therefore, following all the crisis, there were a lot of questions about the financial system and a lot of interest in the no interest banking. And therefore, a lot of institutions and a lot of people started looking at alternatives. Among them, of course, is Islamic finance and economics or Islamic banking. And therefore, financial intermediation, financial institutions were questioned with the collapse of several institutions, like, for example, Merrill Lynch, Lehman Brothers, etc. And following that, we've seen also the European crisis and how a lot of bailout programs by the government were questioned because this is coming from taxpayers' money. And therefore, we had to think about alternative to mitigate all of these issues. And I have here one of the statements from the Vatican saying that Islamic finance might help Western banks in the crisis. And this is the statement from the Vatican saying that the ethical principles on which Islamic finance is based might bring banks closer to their clients and to the true spirit which should mark every financial services. On the other hand, looking at the recent pandemic, and according to the World Health Organization, the COVID-19 pandemic and associated lockdown have adversely affected the global economic activities and has led to dramatic losses of human life worldwide and presented an unprecedented challenge to public health, food systems around the world, and therefore causing economic and social disruptions. And we have all observed that during our daily life, and we're still actually bearing the consequences of the pandemic. During the pandemic, tens of millions of people are at risk of falling into extreme poverty, while the number of undernourished people currently is estimated at nearly 690 million, which could increase by up to 130 million by the end of the year. And nearly half of the world's 3.3 billion global workforce are at risk of losing their livelihoods. In the COVID-19 pandemic, public health, food security, employment, labor issues, in particular workers' health and safety, converge. And the adverse impact on the low economic households is particularly acute, threatening the significant progress made in reducing extreme poverty in the world since 1990s. And this includes, of course, the achievement of the SDGs. So COVID-19 threatens to reverse the progress made on the global goals and a lot of objectives that are set by various governments by 2030. Of course, the SDG agenda, which is bold and requires a lot of changes globally, whether internally in terms of targets, and which has, of course, 169 targets, the application of which varies from country to another, depending on national priorities, depending on key development challenges within each country. And you can see how all of these goals, of course, are bold and require a paradigm shift on how, for example, national strategies are developed and how also like financing is mobilized. And the purpose, of course, of sustainable development is to promote the well-being of not only current generation, but also future generations and their ability to meet their own needs. And this is the Brundtland Commission definition. Now, one of the key challenges in terms of the SDGs is the issue with financing, with about 2 to 3 trillion US dollar of additional investments per annum that are required to meet the SDGs. And achieving the SDGs could open up about 12 trillion dollar of market opportunities in food and agriculture, cities, energy and materials, and health, as well as well-being. Now, one of the key opportunities also is for the private sector, which could play a pivotal role in financing the post-2015 development agenda by delivering profit and development impact simultaneously. One of the particular, of course, these are the 3 pillars of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental. It means that non-financial objectives, being social and environmental objectives, need also to be taken into consideration alongside financial objectives to promote the well-being of societies and human well-being in general. Now, one of the key issues, and one, of course, this is in line with also SDG 13, which is climate action, is, of course, the challenges from climate change, which is basically defined as the issue of our time, and which requires a global mobilization to mitigate its effect, from shifting weather patterns that threaten food production to raising sea levels that increase the risk of catastrophic flooding. The impacts of climate change are global in scope and unprecedented in scale. And without drastic action today, adapting to these impacts in the future will be more difficult and costly. And of course, you can see the next 2 slides actually show some of the devastating impacts. And if nothing is done, then this will negatively impact our planet, but also our well-being as humans. And of course, we spoke about food shortage, heat waves, forest fires, water shortages, sea level rises, drought, carbon cycles, etc., and a lot of threats to the marine ecosystem. On the other hand, there is what we call disaster-induced displacement, and these basically are called weather refugees, in the sense that their displacement is caused by change in weather conditions. And you have here some of the numbers. For example, the Hurricane Sandy in USA, which caused more than 700,000 displaced people. You have rainy season floods in Chad, which caused more than 500,000 people displaced, to cyclones, for example, in Madagascar, and the monsoons in India, typhoons in the Philippines, etc. So that is worldwide about 32.4 million people displaced because of changing weather conditions. Now, if nothing is done, so this is the cost of not doing anything, is basically the accumulated economic losses to rebuild all the infrastructure that is destroyed following for example, the typhoons or the hurricanes, etc. And these are just some of the figures in US billion, of course, with the overall losses from 1950, between 1950s and 2005. And you can see that is increasing, and the trend is increasing with the increase of changing weather conditions. Now, all of this, given all of this, and of course, these are just some of the drivers of why do we need ethics and why do we need to talk about ethics in the financial industry. And this is perhaps a question that I'm also asking the floor, and I would like to have your feedback on it. If you can summarize in 3 words, why do we need ethics in the financial industry globally? So you can see here that there are a lot of values that are needed when talking about, for example, in the context of pandemics, in the context of the financial crisis, and also how social and how financial transactions are being conducted today. So there is a question of values, reconsidering some of the values like social justice, solidarity, fairness, respect, of course. And these all, we've seen all of these values like equality, solidarity, collaboration, etc. during the pandemic crisis. And we've seen a lot of values emerging in certain societies and between certain communities when it comes to helping the poor and needy, and especially the new poor, those who became poor actually following the crisis, either because they don't have like fixed or stable jobs, like some of the independent professions, and those who do not have like long-term contracts in some of the sectors that suffered from the pandemic, like for example, tourism, some of these services, etc. So we saw the emergence of a lot of these values. Now, one of the key concepts to consider when talking about, of course, embedding ethics in the financial industry, talking about climate change or climate responsibility, environmental, social responsibility, is the concept of custodianship, which in Arabic is khilafa, that implies responsibility, amana, and accountability, which is very important. Now, from an Islamic perspective, economic transactions are guided by a set of moral and ethical principles. And these include, of course, justice, solidarity, honesty, fair competition, public interest, transparency, equity, prohibition of usury, speculation, and illicit activities. And these are, in a way, the underlying values that determine how financial and economic transactions are conducted in the Islamic financial industry. On the other hand, you have a social responsibility through profit redistribution, and this is done through a number of institutions, historical institutions as well, like the zakat, almsgiving, awqaf, endowments, charities, sadaqah, and interest-free loans, what we call qard hasan in the terminology. The purpose, of course, is to reduce vulnerability of the poor and mitigate risks. And during the pandemic, all of these, the role of these institutions, which are the Islamic social finance institutions, was questioned. So some of them were effectively contributing to mitigating some of the effects of the negative crisis and the pandemic during the COVID-19 pandemic. But some of them were also questioned because of their absence, actually, in terms of contributing to alleviating some of these issues and helping the poor, especially some of the idle awqaf assets that are not generating any income and are not used for basically helping the poor or low-income populations, and also the effective mobilization and allocation, for example, of zakat. And also, on the other hand, when talking about stewardship, there are 4 important principles about biblical stewardship, because you find also the same terminology when talking about the Bible. And these include ownership, responsibility, accountability, and reward. So it's very important to revisit those principles in the way, and this should drive our actions and the way we use resources in the economy, and the way, of course, we consider financial transactions, our relationship with money, and then our responsibility towards the community. Now, in this context, of course, we have the emergence of terminology. Of course, you will find a lot of different terms sometimes that mean the same thing, but also that have some specific features when talking about embedding ethics in the financial industry. So we're talking about ethical finance, sustainable finance, Islamic finance, responsible finance, etc. So you might come across a variety of terms that sometimes mean the same thing. And as I mentioned, sometimes you have to understand the key differences between each segment and each term. Now, broadly speaking, ethical finance is an activity that invests money in people and the environment, supporting actions for social and or environmental enhancement, and developing depressed areas at high risk of social exclusion. And of course, it has about like 4 key action areas or differences. It looks at the origin of money, the destination of money, the criteria and the values for the use of money, and also the management and objectives of the ethical finance institution itself in terms of governance, and in terms of how its processes and activities are conducted. Now, a key important consideration is that money is used as means and not as an end. And this changes the whole way or the way financial transactions are being conducted. And if you look at, on the other hand, what ethical finance doesn't do, and if you want to compare it to conventional finance or the mainstream finance, is that money is not used for purely speculative purposes. And it's, at the same time, there is a lot of confusion when we talk about embedding ethics in finance, that some people think that it's only about charity. So there's no profit that is generated. And that is wrong because you can, of course, generate good returns. You can have profitable businesses. The key difference is how financial transactions are being conducted. So in this, we're not talking only about charity, but we are taking, in addition, social and environmental considerations by embedding certain objectives alongside financial objectives. Now, also the difference with conventional finance is that in conventional finance, the aim is at maximizing profits only, and that is at the expense of people and the environment. And of course, it also supports any activity or organization that is not sustainable in social or environmental terms, as the main objectives or the key consideration is profit maximization. So to sum up, ethical finance aims to develop a fairer and more equitable interaction between humanity and the environment through the global economy. If you look at the implications, so a lot of policymakers and governments currently are working towards a number of policies or regulations, etc., to embed sustainability in their operations or in their financial systems. For example, in Malaysia, we talk about value-based intermediation, in the sense that how do you embed value in the conduct of all activities. So instead of allocating a portion of your income or profits as an institution to, for example, corporate social responsibility activities or charity actions, etc., and then conduct business as usual, well, contributing to sustainability, it means that you embed value or sustainability considerations in all your activities. And that requires, in a way, a paradigm shift on how business activities are conducted. And these are some of the action areas to align financial system to sustainable development, which of course requires the support from policymakers and a number of changes even at the regulatory level, at the policy level, etc. So among them is one of the key areas that is required is the transformation of culture. So a lot of awareness is needed because these are not common practices, and to allow for their adoption post-crisis, because now we're talking about the new normal following the COVID, for example, 19 pandemic. So that requires a lot of awareness, a lot of transforming culture. And I think today's presentation and this program, this whole program, is about changing mentalities and is about creating that awareness. It also requires directing finance through policy with suitable, for example, regulations and laws that enable the integration of certain objectives. For example, a lot of policymakers or regulators, they have certain objectives or targets for that financial institutions should implement when integrating, for example, a portion of their lending portfolios or allocating a portion of their lending portfolios to green activities, for example, green financing. You have also a lot of policies that look at how to promote new instruments, the development of new instruments to raise financing that is allocated to environmental friendly projects. And we're talking, for example, about green finance. And those of you, for example, who are familiar with the financial industry and capital markets, you must have heard about green bonds or green sukuk, for example, or any other themed issuances like to tackle that aims to finance projects, infrastructure projects in a number of key sectors that have a positive impact on the environment, be it waste management, green buildings, green infrastructure in general, water, which is one of the key challenges, for example, in the MENA region, etc. And of course, the others would require enhancing the market practice and looking at the governance in a way, upgrading the governance and implementing a certain number of measures to create the right ecosystem or the enabling ecosystem to promote aligning the financial system to sustainable development. On the other hand, so we're looking at all of this, and of course, there are a number of segments or a number of key action areas or approaches when embedding ethics in the financial industry. And the idea is that financial institutions are critical intermediaries in what is called the payment system. So they help the economy exchange goods and services for money or other financial assets. And as a key component of the financial system, financial institution allocates funds, and particularly banks, from savers to borrowers in an efficient manner. So they operate in a way as an intermediary between savers who deposit money in a bank and borrowers who receive a loan from the bank. Therefore, providing specialized financial services or revisiting how they embed sustainability in their activities is very important to promote social and environmental impacts. And therefore, we've seen the emergence of ethical banks. For example, you see a lot of them in Europe, and their key differences with traditional banks are the values, in the sense that they operate with a clear set of ethical values that are accepted and respected at all hierarchical levels of the institutions. You have also taken into consideration social and environmental goals, as we mentioned, alongside, of course, financial objectives. There's also a stakeholder participation, in the sense that investment decisions belong to a number of stakeholders, depositors, creditors, etc., who choose the ethical projects to be financed. And two key aspects as well, which are, and this goes back to the issues of traceability, responsibility, and accountability, which are transparency and impact assessment, in the sense that you find that these institutions publish on a regular basis the list of their investment projects that receive financing, but also they publish or disclose information on projects that deliver a positive influence on the society and the environment. And in this regard, you had a lot of indicators that were developed, being it balanced scorecards, impact reporting, etc., that enable the transparency and, of course, reaching out to a key investor base, which is mainly the investors that are ethical, basically ethical investors, socially responsible investors, who look into the impact of their investments, and for that they need to see how their investment contributes to achieving social and environmental objectives. You also have, on the other hand, a key segment called social finance, which is an approach to managing money that delivers social or environmental dividend and an economic return. And this includes a variety of strategies we spoke about, for example, from an Islamic perspective. These are the traditional Islamic institutions like awqaf, zakat, sadaqah, charity, and of course the interest-free loans or Qard Hasan. But you also have other segments that include, for example, micro-lending, sustainable business and social enterprise lending, community investing, grant-making program-related investments, which fall also under the umbrella of social finance. In addition, you have, of course, another area which is developing, which is the sustainable and responsible investing, or SRI. And for those of you who already invest in the stock markets, you must have come across some of these funds that look into integrating social and environmental considerations in, for example, their investment strategies. So it is, in a way, a strategy, or it's a set of strategies that take into consideration the environmental, social, and corporate governance criteria, which are called ESG objectives, to generate long-term competitive financial returns and positive social impact. And when looking at SRI universe, you also will come along, for example, across a variety of terminology or terms that are used to sometimes mean the same thing. But within the SRI universe, you have a variety of strategies and approaches, which include, for example, the screening of investments, the integration of ESG goals, impact and community investing, but also corporate engagement and shareholder action. And now, these strategies, of course, aim to embed or take into consideration additional objectives, not only the maximization of profit, as we mentioned, and then, of course, it's below and proposes, and today they suggest diversified strategies beyond, of course, just the negative screening. And the negative screening is mainly just excluding certain sectors that are considered non-ethical. And you have the same strategy that is adopted, for example, in the case of Islamic asset management, whereby you have two layers of screening investments. One is the sector-based screening, whereby you exclude certain sectors that are considered unethical, for example, tobacco or arms production, etc. And then the second layer is the quantitative or the financial screening, whereby you apply certain financial ratios to determine whether that company or whether that stock is Sharia compliant or not. And then, of course, another strategy which is important is Islamic finance, or another segment, which is a vibrant segment. So today, the Islamic finance industry is estimated at about more than $2 trillion in terms of asset size, and it's projected to grow until more than $3 billion by 2024. And it includes, of course, a variety of segments like Islamic banking, Islamic capital markets, which include investment funds, and also sukuk, which is the Islamic equivalent of bonds, for those of you who are familiar with the debt capital markets. You have also the takaful, that's the equivalent of the Islamic equivalent of insurance. But also you have the Islamic social segments that we mentioned, which is zakat, awqaf, Qard Hasan, Sadaqa, etc. Now, the Islamic financial industry, of course, as you know, is based on a set of ethical considerations. And the key consideration is that money is not to be exchanged for money with profit. And as a result of this prohibition, alternative solutions are given which encourage trade and equity participation. And therefore, transactions should be free from interest, usury, or riba, excessive ambiguities, which is the gharar, gambling, or baisir in Arabic, and of course, any transactions involving prohibited assets and commodities. Another key principle, which is what we call the profit and loss sharing mechanism, or the PLS, which is at the heart of the Islamic finance system. And another key consideration, which is particularly, which was looked at closely following the various financial crises, is the link to the real economy, in the sense that making money out of money is not acceptable. With all the financial transactions needed to be asset-backed. So you are financing transactions that have a direct impact on the real economy. And another key consideration, of course, is social justice and general interest. And this is very important in terms of ensuring the well-being of the communities and the population, and particularly in those difficult times that we are going through, where all the segments of the Islamic economic system need to work and need to be implemented efficiently in order to achieve the objectives of Islamic law, or maqasid al-sharia in Arabic, and therefore to promote human well-being. And finally, talking about corporate social responsibility, which is also known under many names. And these include, of course, corporate responsibility, corporate accountability, corporate ethics, citizenship, stewardship, etc. And we'll see that a lot of companies actually are integrated CSR considerations. If you go into the website of several companies, you will see CSR reports. In Qatar, even you have a national CSR report that is published by the government and looks at the best practices by various institutions. And the idea is that you have, in a way, where the companies are required to acknowledge that they should be publicly accountable, not only for their financial performance, but also for their social and environmental records. And therefore, this includes, for example, issues like promoting human rights, democracy, community improvement, sustainable development objectives, etc. And this, of course, varies from a company to another one, but also from a country to another one, because social issues in one country might differ from another country. And therefore, it promotes in a way, and it shows CSR objectives demonstrate how committed businesses are to contribute to sustainable economic development, working with employees, their families, local communities, societies at large to improve actually the quality of life. This in a way summarizes some of the thoughts about ethical finance, and today some of the challenges that we all need to look at. And I hope that it gave you some insights about some of the key considerations, especially given in the context of the current pandemic that we're going through, and then the post-pandemic, and how we should revisit some of the behaviors, but also our relationship with money and how we deal with financial institutions, or with our basically financial planning in general, because all of us have do financial planning on a daily basis, or if you are actually part of the industry already, so what kind of good practices you need to implement or embed in the activities of your institutions, because we all have a joint responsibility to achieve sustainability, to promote the achievement of sustainable development objectives. And of course, the ultimate objectives is to save our planet, but also to improve the well-being of our well-being and the well-being of the community, but also we have a responsibility towards a future generation, and that's the spirit of sustainable development and also the objectives of Islamic law.
Dear
And I look
Dalal,
forward to receiving questions.
sorry for bothering you, but Ryan raised her hands right now. Maybe he has anything to else say or ask questions. Ryan?
Sure.
Dear Ryan,
Good evening,
can you hear
everyone.
us?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you, Miss Dalal, for this insightful presentation. I did a lot on when talking about ethical finance and ethics in today's world. This reminds me with who shed the light on how the application of ethics leads to economic growth through an equal distribution of resources and its allocation to all people in need. Unfortunately, in this world, we are living in an environment that is based on corruption and clientelism to help, let's say, public officials to satisfy their needs, let's say. And on the other hand, some companies don't comply to corporate social responsibility and many other approaches related to ethical finance. In your opinion, how could we implement a mandatory system in all of the companies to make them comply to all these approaches that are developed in the ethical finance, and how could we encourage these companies to use this ethical finance to leave no one behind on a hand. And in the second question, what are the tools that could companies use through corporate social responsibility and other ethical approach, financial ethic approaches to enhance their sustainability? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions. These are very good questions, and actually, this is a first starting point. Having already these questions in mind, then I'm happy that through this session we triggered these thoughts. So the answer for that is there are two considerations. So basically it requires a top-down and bottom-up approach, a combination of both. So it requires, of course, at the level of governments, of institutions, of policymakers, changes in terms of some of the regulations and all. As I mentioned, for example, you find some of the regulators have already a lot of public policies or regulatory amendments to promote the development or embeddedness of sustainability in their financial systems. For example, you have the principles for responsible banking. You have, for example, frameworks for green finance and issuing green bonds, green sukuk in many countries. Recently, for example, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and of course, a lot of other countries where in terms of green bonds in general or Islamic instruments. You also have certain mandatory requirements to consider in terms of, for example, publishing information, implementing certain measures when it comes to disclosure of information, because we spoke about transparency and impact assessment. But also the bottom-up approach is the institutions themselves and how institutions decide to embed sustainability objectives. There's also the pressure from the market, from the demand. You as customers, you as investors are very important to change or promote the embeddedness of those objectives in the activities of financial institutions. That's why I spoke earlier about an investor base, an ethical investor base, or an Islamic investor base, a socially responsible investor base. So if you require, for example, the integration of those objectives, the more you require, for example, transparency, the embeddedness of environmental social issues from the institutions you deal with, being it financial institutions or companies, etc., this will put pressure on them to integrate those objectives. And you have, of course, in the West, a lot of group of investors mobilization, either through signing some of the declarations to promote the embeddedness of environmental and social objectives. So there is a joint responsibility, as I mentioned, a combination of top-down, bottom-up approaches to achieve those objectives. That's why you have, for example, if you start with the SDG goals or the SDG agenda, you have targets, ambitious targets at the level of governments. For example, a lot of governments have objectives to have a transition or to increase the share of renewable energies in their energy mix by, for example, 2030 or 2050. So these are government level objectives. However, when it comes to CSR objectives, and then I'll go to your second questions, which are some of the tools. Again, corporate social responsibility, you're supporting, for example, the achievement of certain social objectives. And this starts with, of course, your internal activities, like promoting fair wages within your companies. I think in the West, in some of the countries like Scandinavia and all that promote good practices, and especially in terms of governance, they even look at the gap between the highest paid person, the highly paid person in the company, and the lowest paid person. And that gap shouldn't exceed a certain level, for example. So we still have a lot to do, especially in MENA countries or in Arab countries or Muslim countries, in terms of these changes. And of course, these objectives I mentioned would depend on the nature of the social objectives you have in your country. For example, if you are in some of the African countries that have a lot of issues that we've seen that following the pandemic. Nowadays, one of the key issues is access to education. for example, here we didn't have an impact because we have good infrastructure and we were ready to, given the example of HBKU, we were ready from day one to deliver online courses to our students. So we didn't have any, even 1 day interruption in terms of the teaching. However, I know it's not the case. If you look at other countries like in Asia or Africa, where they don't have enough, even access to electricity, access to education was interrupted for months. And that will impact a lot, have serious implications on students. So if you are a company in these countries, you should allocate part of your, for example, CSR activities to supporting education, either by providing, for example, smart tablets to students in remote areas, facilitating access to electricity, to, for example, internet, etc. So a key objective is to focus and embed those objectives in your business activities, but also these should be tailored to the nature of the social problems you have in those countries. And a good practice to follow is what I mentioned, the guidelines, for example, in Malaysia, Bank Negara Malaysia, which is the central bank, came up with a new regulation, which is called value-based intermediation, or VBI. Of course, this is in stage 1, is only applicable to Islamic banks, whereby it requires banks to embed value or sustainability objectives in their business activities, meaning that it's not enough today just to allocate a portion of your profits to, for example, charitable activities or CSR activities, but we're talking to your whole business model, all your activities. So, for example, if you are a bank, you have to demonstrate through your lending or financing portfolio, how do you support sustainability objectives? How do you have an environmental impact? How do you have social impact? And you see that if you go, for example, into the websites of some of the ethical banks in Europe, you will see that even they disclose, for example, their impact on the environment or their carbon footprint. So they will tell you the activities of the bank prevented this many CO2 emissions or contributed to preventing this number of CO2 emissions. So this is our environmental impact. Similarly, you will see some of the sustainability reports by banks or by corporates, and they show that this year, for example, I allocated part of my lending or financing portfolio to a percentage of it, maybe 5% went to sectors like education, and therefore I enabled the creation, for example, of these many job opportunities or schools, etc. So a key thing is the pressure, of course, from the market. You have a lot of NGOs also that are active in terms of preventing, for example, child labor, inequalities in terms of payments of wages, etc. So we do need a lot of mobilization from investors, from customers, from the civil society, etc., to put pressure on those institutions. And this is what will create more and more awareness. And this is what is happening in a lot of Western countries, and you see that impacting the activities of those companies.
Thank you very much for your answer.
You're welcome.
Actually, when I see the chat box, we have 5 more questions, Dr. Dalal, and Mr. Nibras has 4 questions to you, but when I see the time, it's not enough to answer the 4 of them actually, and maybe we can choose one of them as you wish. The first question.
Yeah, we don't have enough time, so maybe we can just pick and choose, or maybe we can just mention all of them to Dr. Dalal, and then she can just give us like a 1 minute or 2 minutes wrap up about these questions. One question is about how to implement Islamic microfinance system in non-Islamic countries for poverty alleviation. And another question is, what are the possible trade-offs of adopting sustainable development strategy in developing countries? And I can see Monia is suggesting a question, but these are the 2 questions that we can maybe, and Fatma is asking how to proceed in the choice between those 2 different approaches. So I guess all the questions are, one is about microfinance in non-Islamic countries or non-Muslim majority countries, and the other one is the trade-offs. Yeah.
Okay, I think I'll try to address all, maybe in a general way, but that allows for, responding to all the participants. But these are very good questions. So as I mentioned, introducing, for example, a new strategy or introducing Islamic finance in general to a country, be it Islamic microfinance or Islamic banking, etc. You have to start with looking at the regulatory framework, the legal and regulatory framework. Does it allow the introduction of these transactions? For example, you see a lot of countries that introduce Islamic finance or Islamic banking. They start with amending, for example, the regulatory framework first. And that includes, because you're talking about Islamic contracts. So the underlying contracts for the Islamic financial transactions, these are Islamic contracts. For example, musharaka, mudaraba, ijara, murabaha, etc. So these need to be first considered, and you need to have in the local regulatory framework. So you start either by having different laws for that, which is, for example, the case, if you look at, as a good example is Malaysia. So they have a dual banking system where everything is replicated. So you have the conventional system and then you have the Islamic system. Or in other countries, you have one set of laws, but then you have chapters dedicated to, for example, Islamic finance. For example, you have to amend your banking law to include certain clauses or chapters which deal with Islamic transactions. And similarly, you look at if you have your securitization law to allow the issuance for sukuk, you look at your insurance law to allow, for example, the development of takaful activities, etc. And this goes also to microfinance institutions which have specific laws and regulations. So if your prevailing system allows that, then you can do it. Because if you don't do that, what happens is you need to fit those transactions within the existing, for example, laws. So, and that will sometimes, the implications that it might have is the cost, the competitiveness of the products. A good example is, for example, when talking about, let's say, murabaha, which is a sale and cost transaction in Islamic, based on Islamic contract of murabaha. If your legal framework is not amended, you will have like the issue of double taxation, because the murabaha involves two transactions. So you have the transaction between you and the bank, and then of course the bank and the service provider. And if your regulatory framework allows for the development of Islamic financial transaction, then you don't have that issue. However, if that is not the case, then you have an issue, for example, in terms of the competitiveness of your product. That's why you see countries who introduced Islamic finance without amending their regulatory and legal framework, they had issues in terms of the competitiveness of their products. So this is briefly. Now, how do you choose between the different approaches that we mentioned? It depends, because it depends again on various factors. And this is again also at the country level, because again, introducing, for example, Islamic finance, it requires changing your, creating the necessary ecosystem, which starts with the legal and regulatory framework. You need to also approval. So in Islamic institutions, Islamic financial institutions need to have licenses to operate in the country. So it starts with the top approach, but also it's demand. So if there is demand, then of course the institutions will be developed. A good example is the UK. The UK, for example, has Islamic financial institutions, but the introduction of those institutions was used based on, for example, the objective of financial inclusion, because you want Muslims also to be financially included, because they don't have access to financial services in the absence of Islamic financial institutions. They will be they were financially excluded, but for, in a way, religious reasons, because they can't deal with conventional financial institutions who are riba or interest based. So it is, if there is demand, of course, that put a little bit of pressure on the governments and the institutions to introduce those services. And the approaches that I mentioned, you can use a combination of all. So if you're using Islamic finance, of course, you need social finance as well, because within, for example, Islamic banks will only target a portion or a segment of the population. However, the very poor or the low income population, you need to develop specific products for them that cater for their needs. And these include, for example, all the social finance segments like microfinance, like awqaf, like zakat, etc. Corporate social responsibility as well. Embeddedness of ESG objectives. So all of these strategies can be adopted in various segments of the financial industry. And their adoption will depend again on various factors, whether you have the proper ecosystem in place and whether there is demand as well for these products. Because if you look at investment funds, you can develop very good strategies, investment strategies that take into consideration social and environmental objectives. But if there is no demand, obviously the business model will not be sustainable. So demand and awareness is also a very important aspect to take into consideration. I think I addressed the two questions.
Yeah. I think for the sake of time and also not having more of our professors like effort, because it's a Thursday, I'm pretty sure she's tired, you know, and I know we have spent she spent quite a bit of time with the meetings today, with the committees and everything. And thank you so much, Dr. Dalal, for joining us and for your support and for your contribution. We are really grateful.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure being with you today. And of course, for the participants, we hope to see you in our college, either in our various programs, so our events. So you'll have a chance also to debate on these issues, which we have like frequent discussions about all of these issues at the college.
Inshallah, we have around 60-65 today in your session, and I think you recorded as well, but we will share with you the recording if you like. And thank you. Inshallah, one day we'll host them. That's one of our plans, by the way, but depending on COVID, of course. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and I wish you a successful program to all. And
thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum to everyone.
Alaikum assalam, Professor Nihat. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you.
Please
it was great presentation, Dalal. It was a really great presentation to sum up all of the, recent discussions surrounding around social finance and all the issues which are discussed in the international arena everywhere in the world. It was very good introduction. Thanks a lot.
Dr. Nihat, are you ready for the next presentation?
Sorry?
Are you ready for the next presentation?
What do you mean by next presentation?
Now we are starting a new presentation.
Yes, we are
yes,
ready.
Dr. Amin will start. Mr.
Yes,
Tok.
Dr. Amin will start. Dr.
Yes.
Amin, please, you can share your screen, and it would be great to see you, actually, if possible. Yes, welcome there, Dr. Amin Mohseni, and it's an honor to have you. Dear everyone, Dr. Amin is one of our amazing professors in the College of Islamic Studies, Howard bin Khalifa University. His areas of expertise are macroeconomics, energy economics, and Islamic economics and finance, and economies of the Middle East and North Africa. He has 12 years of consulting and post-research experience various departments of the World Bank Group, and has taught at academic institutions in the United States, Iran, Qatar, and China. Welcome, Professor Amin. The floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Can I ask everybody to go on mute because I am hearing my echoes back?
Sure.
Again, salam alaikum. Thank you, Dr. Evren, for that amazing and introduction. I don't think I deserve it. It's good to be a colleague of yours in the faculty, and it's good to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And hopefully, I hope that my presentation will have some added value to the whole program, the post-COVID humanity design. So if you guys hear, do you guys hear me just fine? I want to make sure the voice is good.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. I hope you see it right now. So when I was thinking about what to talk about at this program, I had written a paper a while back on the human and social costs of financial crisis and economic downturns. Being a development economist by training and by practice, I am interested on anything that relates to human development, social development, economic development of society, of human beings and societies. So when I looked at all the literature back then, I realized that when we talk about economic recessions and downturns, most of the time, most of the literature is focusing on economic data only. By that I mean, what's the issue with unemployment rate, what happens to growth rates, to GDP, to trade, and so forth. And rarely researchers look at what happens to societies and human beings. And that's what I wanted to focus on, because as we'll see later on, many of the costs of global crisis on humanity, they are permanent, or they are, at the very best, they are long lasting. So therefore, we need to pay special attention to these human and social costs. So let me give you a historical and global overview, which is based on that paper. If you look at this graph, it's the frequency of financial crises in the world from 1800s to 2010. The data set has not been updated yet by Reinhardt and Rogoff, famous economists. And what you can see is this, that when you go from 1800s onward, right, what happens is that the frequency of financial crisis, so these bars right here, there are basically financial and banking crises in the world. For example, a country could have, a banking crisis, another country could have a financial crisis. So these are the some of everything that's happening around the world here. So you can see the frequency is increasing rapidly, especially after World War II. So before World War II, in this area, World War I, we had the World War I, we had the Great Depression, we had the World War II, there was an increase in financial crisis. Then we have a period of stability here. And then with the energy crisis in 1970s, suddenly we see a huge shift of, again, financial crisis frequency of it. And then again, it goes down, but again, it has come back up again. Okay, but the point is this: when you see this trend, is kind of worrisome, that the world is becoming more and more unstable. And one reason that economists refer to is that because we are now more integrated globally, our banking sector, our financial sector, our economy is more integrated. So crisis in one part of the world can easily be contagious to another part of the world, right? And we see with this pandemic as well, something happens in one part of the world, you see suddenly it's spreading all over the place. So the world, as we are seeing it from economic perspective, from financial and banking perspective, also from a health perspective, it is becoming more and more unstable, and there's more uncertainty. If something happens in one part of the world, the probability that it's going to be contagious is higher these days than it was probably 5-6 decades ago. So that's one fact that I wanted just to put out there. So what I did in that research, I said, let me look at all these banking and financial crises. So I compiled between 1981 and 2008. So this was, again, a paper published in 2016. So it doesn't have the current data, but it was working up until the last economic downturn, in the global economic downturn. So I looked at 102 banking and currency and financial crises. And I looked at 13 different human and social indicators before and after those crises. I'm not going to bore you with the methodology, but here is the finding that I found in that across the world. So this is a global analysis. So on average, suicides increase when financial and economic crises happen. And this is and suicide is basically a decline in mental health. It's an indicator that people are becoming mentally unhealthy. Okay, depression, anxiety is taking over when things are uncertain. Okay, and as we saw, the world is becoming more uncertain. So we are going to expect to see the degradations in mental health globally across all populations. Okay, crime increases. This is especially true in middle income countries. About 75% of world's urban poor live in urban slums of middle income countries. And we can probably, from different countries that you are from, you can relate to this, that every single urban area, metropolitans, they have these slums where middle income, where poor are living in there. And that is where mostly the crime happens. With every single economic recession and downturn, no matter what the cause is, there is going to be a number of people that are going to be pushed into poverty. And if they happen to be living in the city, they are going to be pushed towards the slums of the urban areas, and therefore we are going to expect crime rates to increase. And that's what the data also showed, that the crime increases with any economic downturn. Inequality increases both within countries. So in each given country, the gap between the rich and the poor is going to increase anytime there's an economic recession. And we'll see that later on with this pandemic, that's what has happened. And also between countries, the richer countries and the gap between richer countries and poorer countries is also going to increase. And it's also going to be multi-dimensional inequality. It's not only about wealth or income, it's also about educational inequality, health inequality, security inequality, right? So from all these aspects, we will see that the richer countries, the gap between richer and poorer countries and the population who live in these countries is going to increase from different dimensions. Another thing is that malnutrition spikes up. Usually what happens first is that food quality measured in protein intake takes a larger hit than food quantity, meaning that what happens when there is an economic crisis and people have to choose what to eat and what not to eat, what they will choose is that they will let go of the quality of the food so that they can get enough calories. So we'll see that protein intake as a measure of quality is going to go down before calorie intake goes down. And so there's a shift from more expensive, higher quality food to cheaper, lower quality food, and that can definitely have health ramifications. But what's more important is this, that malnutrition in the first 12 months of a life of a human being will have permanent negative impacts on physical and cognitive development of individuals. So it doesn't really matter if a newborn infant is malnutrition in the first 12 months of his or her life. It doesn't matter what he or she eats after that, what kind of access to food he or she has after that. The damage is already done on her physical and cognitive development. So basically, this is a time-sensitive issue. Also, we see that health and educational expenditures decline. There is a shift from private to public education and health provisions. So in countries that some families are well-to-do families can send their kids to private schools or can have private provisions of health. With the economic downturns, they will shift to public provisions. This is going to increase the strains on public provisions of education and health. It's going to decline the quality of education and health services across the board for everybody, for the kids who were already dependent on public education and health, and also for the kids who are transitioning or the families who are transitioning from private to public provisions of these services. Again, with health expenditure and education expenditure, these are time-sensitive issues. We cannot say, okay, so if somebody is sick, let's just not get the health care we need right now, we'll get it later. Well, the damage is done. And sometimes these costs are permanent or very, very much long-lasting. So these are time-sensitive issues. If there is a gap in the providing these provisions, we cannot basically come back from the damage that is done by the lack of these provisions. And also government welfare program experiences huge cuts. And who depends on government welfare programs is the vulnerable, is the poor, lower income families, and they will get hit the hardest when crises happen. And and finally, we have seen that the case of divorces or family structures also break down, and divorce cases also increase. So we see that when the financial crisis or economic crisis happens, this is the global overview, by the way. Again, on average, we see that human welfare and society's welfare declines as well with every single financial or banking or economic crisis. But usually we don't pay attention. What we hear in the news is that how much GDP went down, how much unemployment has gone up, how much trade has gotten hit, what happened to the stock market, and so forth, without understanding that beyond those numbers, beyond those economic data, there are actual human beings that are living, and there are actual societies that are experiencing those hardships. And by the way, these financial crises, they are usually, as expected, on average, high-income countries perform better because they have a larger cushion, financial cushion, and They can most of the time borrow in the market and try to cover their gaps. And but what was surprising is this, that middle income countries on average perform worse than low income countries in many of these situations, because what's happening is that in middle income countries, the family bonds compared to low income countries, right? The family and society bonds are weaker, and therefore when faced with crisis, people find themselves on their own, okay? Because the government is not doesn't have enough finances like high income countries, they cannot depend on the government. On the other hand, because the family and societal links are weaker than low income countries, they don't have any other person to depend on. Therefore, usually in middle income countries, when they are hit with crisis, people find themselves alone, while in the low income countries, there might be some sort of a family and societal support happening. Also in middle income countries, there's something called sudden stop, because there's a lot of investment sometimes from other richer countries, and those investments stop coming in, and that these countries depend on. So that said, so that was past. So this was basically a global overview, and the data shows that human and social welfare will get a big hit when faced with crisis, especially now in this case, economic crisis. But let's look at the state of the humanity. You know, I named this a state of humanity because usually, like in the US, you say a state of the union address, in Europe as well. But at the end of the day, as I said, that the world is getting more interconnected, right? So instead of looking at one country or one economy or one region, we need to look at the whole globe to get a better understanding of what's happening. That's why I named this couple of other slides, State of the Humanity. Let's look at the poverty headcount ratio at $1.90 a day. And if you know anything about economics, when we say PPP, it means purchasing power parity. That means that what kind of a life a person would have living at $1.90 a day in the US. Okay, that's what we are talking about here. Okay, so and that is if anybody knows anything about the US, that wouldn't be a very good life. Okay, it would be a horrible, it would be severe poverty. So we call 1.90 threshold severe poverty, absolute, severe poverty. And we see that, let's look at the black line. Okay, these are different regions. You can probably look at it later yourself. But the black line is the globe. So in 1993, we start around 34% of the people, 1/3 of the population, humanity living in severe poverty. It has gone down to about 10% by 2018. So that's good news, right? The population, only 10% of the population are living in severe poverty, where in fact about 2 or 3 decades ago, almost 30%, more than 30%, 1/3 were living in severe poverty. But it still is, so that's a good news, but it's bad news as well, right? Because 10% of the population, humanity, is about 750 million people, and that is not a small number, okay? And what we see here, that this decline for the black line was mainly driven by decline in East Asia, which is China, basically. So China was able to reduce its poverty rate significantly because of its massive growth rates. It also happened to be that in South Asia, mainly India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, Afghanistan, again, the population, the percentage of population living in severe poverty decreased. But many of the regions, more or less, the situation stayed the same. Okay. So good news is it has gone down, but bad news is that we still have 10% of population living in severe poverty, 1 out of 10% in this world, right? Let's look at the data here. I have put in the population 7.7 billion people. Adult population is about 5.7 billion people. Poverty headcount ratio at 1.9 a day PPP, right? It's about 9% to 10%, 708 million people. At $3.20, which is still poverty, but not as bad as 1.90, we have 24% of the population. At 5.5, at $5.50 a day, meaning that somebody who has $5.50 a day in US, what kind of a life that person has? We know that's not going to be a pretty life, right? Again, we see about almost half of the population of the globe are living on a poverty rate of $5.50 a day. What is worrisome is this, red lines here. Because of the pandemic, we are expecting 100 million more people be pushed into $1.90 poverty threshold, right? 100 million more people, and 176 million more people are going to be pushed into the poverty measured at $3.20 a day. Okay, these are not good trends. So we are going to see right here, we are going to see a reversal. Okay, there's going to be a reversal, and we'll see that global poverty headcount ratio increasing because of the pandemic. Access to basic necessities that most of us take for granted. 10% of the population globally don't have access to electricity. That's again 770 million people. 29% of population don't have access to safely managed drinking water services. These are the things, guys, we take for granted, most of us. No access to safely managed sanitation services, bathrooms. 55% of people globally don't have access to it, like more than half of the people in the world. Okay, not having access to internet, 51%. Okay, illiteracy rate, I'm sorry, is at 14%. Okay, and what you don't see down here, it was basically having access to banking accounts that many of us again take it for granted. Again, we are seeing that around 1.7 billion people. It's about 30% of population again globally. 35% do not have access to any kind of financial services as well. And these are huge, huge numbers, right? That again, most of us take it for granted, but we see that huge chunk of world's population don't have access to these basics that we have access to. When it comes to food and nutrition, population going to bed hungry before the pandemic was 11%. After the pandemic, we are expecting to be 12%. Okay, and population of moderately or severely food insecure is about 26%. Okay, so these are basically, right now we are experiencing about 12% of population, about 1 billion people going to bed hungry at night, and about 2 billion people, they are severely or moderately food insecure, meaning that maybe they have food today, but they are not sure if they are going to have food tomorrow. And again, I cannot get my head around this because again, I would argue that most of us have not experienced such situations, right? So these are the situation of the humanity. And when we look at displaced population, 80 million people, refugee population 26 million, and children living in conflict zones, 420 million children, right? So I'm providing this data here, and I really don't, as a development economist, right, I play with these, I look at these numbers, I analyze these numbers on a daily basis, right? But what has happened is this, that some people use these numbers and they just don't listen to it and they just pass by it. Okay, we are talking about huge number of people that could have been, many of us that are here are not experiencing this situation, but it could have, there is no guarantee that could have been us or not. So what I'm trying to get at eventually is this, I'm presenting these numbers here to create the empathy and sympathy, because that is the main motivation. That is the starting step. If you want to do something about all of these problems that we have globally, there has to be, at the beginning of it, there has to be an empathy and sympathy towards the situation, and that will drive our passion. Let's look at the pandemic and see what the pandemic has done. The pandemic, you have heard this, that they say coronavirus does not distinguish between rich and poor. Everybody gets it. And yes, from presidents to celebrities to poor people to rich people, people are getting the pandemic, the coronavirus. But what the pandemic is distinguishing is its impact on the livelihood of the people. Let's look at this data here. This is data, this is from the US, but this the same trend is almost everywhere else is the same. So in economics, we divide people into deciles of income groups, right? The lowest decile is the poorest population, second decile, third decile, and basically the 9th decile and the 10th decile, right? So these are the richest, basically this is 20% of the population, richest, poorest 10% of the population, and so forth. And look at the vertical axis. It says share in shutdown sectors. Okay, we see here that people in the lower income deciles, right, they are 20% they compose basically the largest share of the sectors that are shut down. For example, retail sector. Who works in the retail sector? Who works in the restaurant sector, right? Many of those consumer-facing sectors that were shut down because of the pandemic, the people who were working those jobs, they belong to the lower income deciles. Okay, so basically, if the pandemic hits, shutdowns happen, and who gets hurt the most? People in the lower income groups. Okay, so there's definitely an inequality happening here because of the pandemic. In the US alone, more than 43 million lost their jobs between April and June 2020. This is 43 million people, okay? This is a huge number of workers, right? In the same period, the wealth of the top 5 US billionaires, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Zuckerberg, Buffett, and Larry Ellison, rose by $102 billion. And they increased their wealth together 26%. In the same period that 43 million people are losing their jobs. The combined wealth of US billionaires increased by over $637 billion in that time period to an amazing figure of 3.6 trillion. If you want to put that into context, US billionaires' wealth is $1 trillion more than the entire GDP of 54 countries on the continent of Africa. Okay, and in this continent, around 500 million people live. Okay, so this is the amount of inequality we are dealing with. Before pandemic, there was inequality, but definitely the pandemic is adding and is exacerbating the situation. In the US alone, by the end of August 2020, more than 2 million mortgage loans were 90 days delinquent, meaning that people who had bought houses and they had mortgages on those houses to pay, they could not pay it. And eventually they're going to lose their house, and the bank is going to take their house with all the down payment. They're going to lose everything, basically, right? While at the same time, 2 million new mortgages were also issued. So who got those 2 million new mortgages? Basically the richer group of the population who were trying to use the low interest rates to buy houses at bargain prices, okay? So while in one part of the economy, one segment of the population, they are losing their houses, another segment of the population, they are buying new and bigger houses. Again, this pandemic has been unequal when it comes to gender, okay? If you look at this data right here, pandemic has hit the woman the harder, okay, across all age groups, right? Again, this is share of the genders in shutdown sectors, right? You'll see the woman, female population, they are the larger share, they present larger share of the shutdown sectors in the economy. Okay, in the US alone, again, women are 4 times more likely than men to drop out of labor force. So this is dropping out of labor force, not being unemployed, right? Somebody who is unemployed and looking for a job, we call them unemployed. They don't have a job, but they look for a job, they're unemployed. But if somebody does not have a job and is not looking for a job for various reasons, they got depressed or discouraged, or they just decided not to look for a job for any reason, they just drop out of labor force, okay? And about 865,000 women left workforce in August and September alone, compared to 216,000 men, mainly because they had to take care of their children, the woman, right? When their childcare services was not available because of the pandemic. So whatever gains that was gained in the past decade when it comes to wage equality between female and male, and also labor force participation rates have been going up amongst the females. This pandemic basically wiped out all of those gains in the past 10 years, at least in the advanced economies. And I'm having data that is same thing in the developing and middle income countries as well. So the pandemic is definitely exacerbating the inequality issue. Okay, when you look at, again, globally, roughly 1/3 of workers worldwide, around 2 billion people, work in informal sectors. Most of these jobs are in the developing countries. And what we know from the informal sector, they are basically consumer-facing sectors, where people, selling things in the streets or having a small shop somewhere. Because of the pandemic, those businesses are basically shut down. So about 2 billion people, about 1.6 billion of them they are basically, their jobs are threatened by the pandemic and they're not able to make their livelihoods. Okay, so and you can imagine the economic, political, and social instabilities that these large groups of people, unemployed people, or people that are being pushed into poverty, is going to have on the global structure. So this is a very, very pessimistic view, right? It's a very pessimistic view, but I always, tell my students that when you see problems this big, that means there are great opportunities to do good work. And that's what we are here, right? All of us are here because we have some concern about humanity post-COVID, right? And we have some passion to do something, okay? So I hope that this data will create enough drive in most of us to actually start doing something. So what's the policy implications of what I have just talked about? Cost of crisis, especially pandemic crisis, are immensely underestimated. We talk about, $10 trillion of, economic cost of this current pandemic, but if you add to it the lives lost, the illnesses that are going to get created, the inequality that's going to increase, the crime that's going to increase, right? All of these things that we talked about, the malnutrition, the poverty rates that's going to increase, all of these things will have long-term or permanent consequences that we need to add to the economic cost of the pandemic, okay? And many of these things, by the way, inequality, crime, poverty, they have a strong inertia. That means when they go up, they can go up very easily, right? But it's very hard to bring them back down to a level that we want to, okay? They have a high inertia. Policies are not designed to effectively target losses in human and social well-being. What we have is that we try to address unemployment, hoping that unemployment, if you address it, is going to address all the other costs that we talked about, okay? So there's this implicit assumptions that economic recovery will also result in recovery in other aspects of well-being, but it's not, because other aspects, they may not ever recover. And there is also the idea that many of these well-being indicators are associated with strong inertia. So economic indicators, they recover. Yes, you might have your GDP come back, you might have your unemployment rates go down, but you will not be able to immediately reduce, for example, depression or anxiety in society. You will not be able to bring people who committed suicide back to life. You will not be able to, the children who had malnutrition during the time of crisis, the damage is already done. You cannot reverse that anymore, okay? So there is this huge underestimation of the costs of the crisis. So the idea here is this, that we as policymakers, we as practitioners and activists, we need to push for special policies, special protections for human and social welfare when crises happen. We should not say, okay, we are going to have, when the GDP grows back, when unemployment goes back down, everything is going to be fine. Everything is not going to be fine, okay? So when crises happen, we need to pay a special attention to these human and social welfare programs. We should not cut it. And with most of the countries, when they face crisis, the first thing the government does, it cuts from the welfare programs, okay? Instead, crises provide opportunities, right, to basically broaden these programs and reduce multidimensional inequality and deepen human capital. Why do I say that? During good times, governments do not have the mandate or do not have the justification to expand welfare programs. It's not popular during good times, okay? Because economy is doing good, unemployment is down, so why should we provide for social welfare programs? But during downturns, this provides the government with the opportunity to enact those programs because there's a political and social justification for it, and to keep these programs in place, okay, for the people who are never going to recover from these downturns. So that's at the policy level. But at the individual level, what needs to be done is that we need to develop empathy towards humanity. And that's what's missing, I think, most of the time in the advanced economies and developed world, right? We have to actually practice. We have to actually practice not to be indifferent or insensitive. has become commonplace. We are sitting at a dinner table, we read the news, the TV is on, talks about refugees, talks about all these miseries around the world, and we just listen to it, we continue eating our dinner, unfortunately. And that is, I think, the greatest tragedy that the humanity has faced, that we have become insensitive and indifferent, some of us, to such data and such situations. After that, we have developed the sympathy and empathy. We have to educate ourselves on various issues threatening humanity. There's tons of opportunity to do good work. We cannot address global issues. Of course, some of us have that capacity. They are, but most of us know, but we can think globally while acting locally. We have to actively look for opportunities to reduce human pain in any way we can around us. It starts from the local places. Actively look for, find, organize, and work with individuals who share the same visions as we do. Programs like this are amazing opportunities to link with others all around the world, to actually push forward with policies and programs that we are passionate about. And we have to remain focused, of course. Flexibility and adaptability is the name of the game these days. There's a lot of uncertainties out there. Uncertainty, as I say all the time, is the new normal. Volatility is the new normal. We cannot think what's going to happen even next week nowadays. Okay, so we have to be ready to be flexible and adaptable. And we have to take risks. Conventional methods don't work anymore. We have to think about unconventional but promising methods. And last but not least, financial sustainability and independence is a must. To do anything, we need financial power. And this idea of social entrepreneurship is the name of the game, that we have to be able to provide enterprises that creates, that solves, that addresses some of the problems that we already saw because of the crisis and pandemics, but also generates income by itself. Okay, just like I think a couple of days ago at the faculty and Hamad bin Khalifa University, we had a program on social entrepreneurship. Something like Launch Good, for example, right? It's a program, it's a social entrepreneurship endeavor that's creating millions of dollars, but at the same time is doing good work globally. So let me end with one verse from the Quran that again it relates to this idea of and the importance of having sympathy and not being indifferent. In chapter 5, Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 32, we read in the verse that says, كتبنا على بني إسرائيل أنه من قتل نفسا بغير نفس أو فسادا في الأرض فكأنما قتل الناس جميعا ومن أحياها فكأنما أحيا الناس جميعا. We decreed upon the children of Israel, the Bani Israel, that whoever kills a soul, kills a person without a justification, unless for a soul or for corruption, kills somebody without a justification, it is as if he had slain the entire mankind. And whoever saves one soul, it is as if he have saved the entire mankind. That's what I want to focus on. If we can change the life of a one person, from Islamic perspective, it is as if we have saved the entire mankind. And something similar to this was a poet called Saadi Shirazi, a 13th century poet, has a very nice couple of lines. I want to end with this. It says, human beings are members of a whole in creation of one essence and soul. If one member is afflicted with pain, other members uneasy, they will remain. If you have no sympathy for human pain, the name of human you cannot retain. So this poem is actually in Farsi, in Persian, but this, I found this nice translation online for it. So again, I want to emphasize, let's not be indifferent. We know there's a lot of misery going on around the world. We can start locally to address those miseries as much as we can, because if we save one person, and if we are not indifferent, it is as if we have saved the whole humanity. I'm going to end with this, and thank you for listening. And if there are any questions, comments, corrections, suggestions, I'm more than happy to take them. Thank you.
Alina, yes, the echo was coming from. Anyway, it's gone now. Dear Dr. Amin, thank you so much. Echo is still coming. Please help with that. Yes. Okay. Dear colleagues, okay, I can see the message about the book. Who is winning the book? It will be end of today, not now. And any questions, please?
Yes.
You can actually. Who? I cannot hear.
Me. I want to ask a question.
Okay, yes, go ahead, Ryan. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Evren, for giving me the floor. Dr. Amin, thank you very much for this insightful presentation as well. It is really informative, and that's what we need actually in this world to reduce inequalities under this tough situation we're facing due to COVID-19. You have insisted in the end of the presentation about showing empathy uh, and in order to design better humanity after in the post COVID-19 era and during this phase as well. Unfortunately, what I can see, what we are seeing is there is lack of empathy at some extent, even on when it comes to the usage of digital platforms that don't promote the values of empathy, solidarity, and peace between all people around, despite all the efforts made by international organizations and agencies to promote the human values. My question is, at which extent, let's say, the legislation of social media usage could help us empower people in need and reduce this poverty that is expanding nowadays, and on the other hand, leave no one behind in order to make everyone on the same page. Legislation through putting, I mean, in terms of putting some restrictions in a way that it develops simultaneously uh, the values of freedom of speech and freedom of expression as part to enhance collaboration between all stakeholders to build strong economies. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not a social media expert. I would like to maybe pass this question maybe to Dr. Evren, because he has done a lot more work on with social media. But definitely. So I think that what you are getting at is very important. So there needs to be a top-down approach and also a bottom-up approach, right? So what I focused on here was a top-down approach in economic policy making. But definitely social media in this time and age, it is part of economic policy making as well. It cannot be separate from it, but also from bottom-up approach that I focused on, that is making the empathy. So, but when it comes to legislating the use of the social media, again, I'm not an expert on that. I'm sure there is a room for that and there's an importance for it. So I'm not gonna start guessing on it. So if there is any, Dr. Evren, if you have any comments on that, please go ahead. If not, you can probably think about it.
Yeah, I mean, definitely we can talk about the role of social media at a different time, but today is your day, Professor. So we want to get the questions to get more of your wisdom. We can arrange other sessions about social media later. There are, I think, interesting insights about that. But right now I see another question.
Dr. Evren, let me just comment here. But at the very least, having access to social media, right? We see that 50% of the population, about 40% of the population don't even have access to internet, let alone social media, right? So just creating that access to those populations who don't have it, so they can share their stories, their experiences, the way they view their life, right? And the world. That by itself will do magic in reducing inequality, right? Just providing that access to it from technical perspective. But from legislation, I'm not really sure. We have to think about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you, Professor. Of course, maybe just I can mention one single very limited area where social media can help, actually, is that, the most of the governments, I mean, especially municipalities, they are using social media to get feedback from citizens. So e-governance or smart governance and so on and so forth. So sometimes it helps if people kind of like vocalize their perspectives on social media, so the government leaders, policymakers can better understand what's going on really, like on the field. So this is why this is important, because rather than the governments doing policies without knowing anything about the population, then this is a way of transmitting information on the ground, and it's also enabling evidence-based policy making, I believe, right? So because often governments, what do they look into when they make policies? The prices or what? But human behavior is the most important information and data that can be used in order to make policies. So you don't do things that's against the will of the people or against the kind of the common trends. So but maybe it's the topic of another conversation for sure. But thank you, dear Nayan, for this question. And let's have Esneira Salem, please. I can see your hand.
Oh, yes, good evening, everyone. Professor Amin, thank you very much for that very comprehensive presentation. I'd like to go back with the last part of your presentation, where you talk about policy. You've underscored that governments have really great role in playing in how we will slowly recover from this pandemic and this financial crisis that it brought to us. Um, my question is, in 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 the side of the governments, what sort of policies should they focus on aside from addressing the health effects of the corona pandemic, and as in a global scale, what sorts of collaboration should they undertake? Because this, as you said, is affecting everyone, and it should require every collective actions from every countries, whether you're high or low income countries. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for that question. In terms of global collaboration, definitely there needs to be more integration and more synchronization of policies in place. We have seen, at least from the health perspective, one country does one thing, another one does another thing. And when we talk about pandemics, we all have to be on the same page. Otherwise, the effect of individual countries' policies or individual states or cities is not going to be as effective as we want them to be. But when it comes to economic policy making, it's the exact same way. Global economy is ever more interconnected. So if, for example, country X is trying to stimulate the economy by reducing their interest rates, by reducing taxes, by government expenditures, but country Y, which is their trade partner, is not doing the same thing, right? And so if you are basically trading from a country X, you're exporting from country X to country Y. So country X is trying to boost the economy, but country Y is not boosting the economy, so they cannot import as much. Then country X's efforts will be undone, basically canceled out or not as effective. So there has to be a concerted effort that, especially between trade partners, countries that are strongly linked to each other from banking and financial sector and also from trade sector, for them to be able to move together and to enact policies together. And again, I think what this pandemic has shown is that there needs to be a more collaborative and synchronized effort between all countries, especially those countries that are linked to each other a lot stronger than others. So that's one thing. But within countries, definitely, where I'm coming from is this, that when crises happen, and when the data shows that with each crisis, be it health crisis or financial crisis, an economic crisis, whatever it is, right? When crises happen, the poor population, the people in the lower income brackets, they get hurt the hardest. That's the given fact. We have seen that several times, okay? So if the governments know this, they have to have policies in place. Some governments might do. I have not done a global analysis here, but most don't, okay? That will pay a special attention to the circumstances that these groups of population are going to go through. What we are seeing happening globally in Europe, in America, and also in Asia, we are always playing catch up. Basically, we wait to see what happens, and then we start scratching our heads as policymakers, and we say, okay, what should we do right now? And then we start discussing it, And by the time we pass the bills, by the time we implement them, a couple of months has passed, the damage is already done, if we actually are able to pass the bills. And from what we see in the US, for example, there's a deadlock. You know, they had this, policies in place for a few months that it ended, and they could not agree, the different branches of government, how to extend it. And so people are left without something to go back to. There's no security, there's no safety net for them anymore. Okay, so this is not acceptable. So these things should not be by discretion. These things should be set in law. Basically, we say it should be automatic, that when such and such crisis happen, when people get unemployed, there is these supportive policies in place. And people oftentimes says, okay, who's going to pay for it? That's a big question, right? They say money, where's the finances for this is going to come from? Well, I tell you, as I showed you in that slide, what has happened during the same time that 40 million people lost their jobs, what happened to the wealth of the 5 big billionaires in US? It increased. So there is money out there, right? It's a zero-sum game, basically. So the wealth is being transferred basically because we are living in a, there's no other planet that money comes into or wealth comes into it. We're living in a closed global system. So what's happening globally at our planet level, right? Anytime crisis happen, the poor gets poorer. So that means there's a transfer of wealth from the poor society, poor communities to rich communities. So the money is there. We should stop this transfer with every single crisis. Okay, the finances is there. It's just a matter of policy put in place that when we have such levels of high unemployment, we have such levels of economic uncertainty, the government should be able to tax more. Just like that, overnight, the tax is going to go up. Okay, and provide for the welfare programs that the most vulnerable people need. Because at the end of the day, this growing gap of inequality is not going to be sustainable at the global level and also at the country level. There's going to be a lot of social and political ramifications for it and instabilities. And people have to understand that, maybe for 5 years, maybe for 10 years, we are going to be okay with these increasing inequalities, but this is not sustainable. Okay, so yes, there is rooms. The finances, I argue the finances is there, the resources is there to protect more social safety net, not less, for the vulnerable population anytime crisis happen. And these efforts should be all synchronized across countries that are strongly linked together so that the effect will be larger.
Alina, do you see any questions?
Yes, Mr.
I
Talk.
have some questions here.
The echo is coming right now.
I think it's okay now, yeah.
Okay, dear Zaid asked a question actually. Actually, she said, he said, it's not a question, okay. So we have another questions, dear participants.
I see something in the chat here. It says COVID has magnified the
Yes.
capitalist economies. What do you think is better economic model in developing Muslim majority countries moving forward? So let me just mention here, there is no one single capitalistic economy. When we look at capitalistic economy, the US is a model of capitalistic economy. Japan is a model of capitalistic economy. Sweden is a model of capitalistic economy. Germany is, UK is, right? And all of these countries, they have done differently, protecting their population. Okay? So I would not put it all in one basket. Okay? There are different models of capitalistic economy. And what does it mean to be capitalistic, right? That's also something that we have to, we don't want to argue here. There's a whole class that we can talk about this. What is capitalism versus socialism versus Islamic economics and so forth, right? But I will tell you that, yes, COVID has magnified the failure of American capitalism, definitely. Or UK capitalism. But when it comes, let's say, to countries like northern Scandinavian countries, like Sweden, right? They have done a lot better. Okay, because they have, they call it social capitalistic economies, right? They have a sense they have an understanding that, you know, we are all in the same boat. We have to all go together. We cannot leave people behind. Okay, and we see that those societies have done better than I would say Anglo-Saxon societies. Okay, so yeah, so there is, and what is the better economic module in developing Muslim majority countries moving forward? Definitely have to pay attention to our heritage. Definitely have to pay attention to our heritage. We have a rich heritage. Okay, if you go back and look at the economic history of the world or scientific history of the world, you know, you'll see that what kind of a heritage we are coming from. Okay, and there are elements in that heritage. For example, waqf and awqaf is one of those things in Islamic society, right, that can invigorate societies, that can make them grow. Okay, provide social safety nets for society, for population, without government's involvement. Specifically, when you look at Islamic heritage, it's mostly communities, not the governments. And that's what makes it more versatile. That what makes it more adaptable and more flexible. Because governments, they have their own agendas, politicians. They think, yes, they might think about society, but most of the time they also think about their own office, their own party. Okay, and if sometimes they are in contradiction with each other, most of the time they choose the party and the benefit of their own office. So when it is at the hand of the people and community, they know what to do the best. They can take care of the poor, they can take care of the vulnerable, they can take care of the needy when the time comes, because they understand as a community that when crisis happen, next time I could be the one that needs the help. Okay, and that has been basically the legacy of awqaf that we have, the legacy of zakat that we have in our tradition.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Actually, I cannot see any questions more in chat box, Mr. Talk.
There, Alina. There, Professor. Thank you so much for your support and your contributions. We are really grateful, and
Yes.
we look forward to hosting you again, inshallah, in Ramadan, and as we agreed. And once again, as the DPCH Tarahum program, we are extremely appreciative of your support, and we wish you a pleasant weekend. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Evren, and for the good work that you are doing. Actually, you know, putting this program together and actually discussing these issues is the first step, inshallah. And I hope that it doesn't stop here. I hope it doesn't stop here. We can all move forward with some
Jazakumullah khair. Shukran jazilan, inshallah. Yatik al-afiyah.
Thank you, everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum assalam.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
There,
We cannot hear you, Mr. Talk.
thank you so much, Edna. Dear students, stay tuned. I believe your next gathering is not tomorrow, right? The group work tomorrow or no? No, you will get the updates on Slack, but on Sunday you have a networking event with Stilatech, and our events will keep running and rolling. And I'm pretty sure this, like, more than 50 people who are here today are the most committed ones. There's no doubt about it. And when you are committed to something, and when you stick to what you believe in, you always get the reward. Like, I think this is an important philosophy. The most important thing is really like putting yourself out there and sticking to things that you really love from your heart. It's really critically important. So thank you. And Alina, please, time to close.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yes, exactly. I am agree with you with my whole heart, Mr. Talk. And I cannot say to this mural feedback session, guys, today we're gonna be on your murals, so just be ready for this.
You said today, you mean tomorrow?
Today we have it.
You have it. Okay, excellent.
Yes, we have it today and tomorrow also.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, take care, guys.
Hello.
Thanks, Alina. Bye.
See you. Goodbye for today.